Hello and welcome to the fourth video in this beginner's guide to Adobe After Effects. In this tutorial, I'm going to discuss compositions in After Effects. In the previous episode, I discussed in depth the timeline panel and how layers work. Now, in After Effects, all the layers we see down in the timeline panel are contained in what is called a composition. Now, compositions are what we use to help build video presentations in After Effects. In this video, we are going to be covering the following topics: what are compositions, composition tabs, and how to create compositions. After this video, you will get a better understanding of how compositions work, so you will feel more comfortable moving forward. So let's get into it. So what is a composition? So when you begin a new project in After Effects, you essentially start with a clean slate with nothing whatsoever. When beginning an After Effects project, we typically begin by creating a composition, or a comp for short. This is done by clicking the New Comp button, or coming up to Composition in the top bar and clicking New Comp. For now, I'll just click OK for our new comp. With the new composition created, you will see it is now shown in the project panel over on the left, represented with the composition icon. In After Effects, a composition is represented by this graphic, a film clip with some shapes. In this instance, the comp is called Comp1 by default, as I did not name it. With the new composition ready, we can see a blank screen in the visual composition panel and an empty timeline panel down below. So a composition is essentially an empty vessel to place our media content into, such as video, text, animation, or audio files. As you begin to add your media elements into the timeline panel, you will start to build your layers, which creates the composition. So here we are in an After Effects document with one composition in the project panel, consisting of lots of layers, which we can see in the timeline panel. Now, some After Effects projects can include many individual compositions to create an entire video presentation. Let's now jump to another example. So in this example, we can see a number of compositions in the project panel. And if we look closely in the timeline panel below, we can see that some of the compositions have been placed into another composition. Now, some video or animated sequences can be very complex and require lots of layers. So we could use compositions as a way to focus on particular sequences, organize and manage complexity in a project. Now, another way to think of compositions is to think of them like groups. Compositions can be used to group lots of layers, and then the individual comps can be placed into one main composition, like in this example. So let's take a closer look at this example I have open here to learn more about compositions. To follow along with this tutorial, you will need to open up this document I have prepared especially for this video. This can be found in the Introduction folder in the Project folder. Now you can download this project folder for a small fee. The download link with instructions is in the description. The download folder comes with lots of exercise documents we will be using on this course that have been carefully developed to aid your learning experience. The folder also comes with document resources such as videos, graphics, and images you can use to build your first video presentation from scratch later on in this course. To get the full learning experience, I recommend you get the project folder. Download link with instructions is in the description. So with the project folder open, click into the S1 Introduction folder, into the fourth folder, Compositions, and open the Hyde Park After Effects file. And you should have something that looks like this. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the timeline panel. Across the top here, we can see this composition is 1 minute long, and below this, we only have 7 layers. Now, if I drag my time indicator to the start and press spacebar to activate preview, we can see that there are lots of things happening in the composition visually, but only 7 layers in the timeline panel. Now, if we look closely to the left of the timeline panel, we can see the name and icon for each layer. These icons indicate what type of layers these are. In this instance, we can see that each layer is a composition layer, and we can tell this because of the icon next to each of them. As seen earlier in the project panel, again, we can see the composition icons indicating that these are compositions. Now, if we double click on one of these composition layers, and let's start with the video edit stills layer, upon double click, This composition layer will now open in the timeline panel. Notice now we can see all the individual layers that make up this composition. Here we have the video, type, shape and image layers. And we know this because of the icons next to each over on the left. Now, it's important to note that a single composition like this in After Effects contains both visual and time information represented in two separate panels. When we have a composition open, we see the timeline information in the timeline panel here at the bottom, containing all the layer elements. And above, we see a visual representation of these layer elements in the composition window. As we click on some of the layers in the timeline panel, we can see them selected in the visual composition panel above. When creating a composition in After Effects, we use these two panels together to control the time and visual dynamic of the presentation. So next, I want to draw your attention to the composition tabs. Now, what are composition tabs? So currently, we have this composition open. And if we look carefully in the top left corner of the timeline panel, we have a tab that shows the composition name. Notice this is currently highlighted, and to the left of this is another tab. So if we click this, we can see we are back to our composition called main sequence. So currently we have our main sequence and the video edit stills comp open in the tab. So next I will come down to another layer in the main sequence, and this time I will double click on the video edit wildlife layer. Upon double click, the composition layer will now open in the timeline panel. So again, like earlier, we can see all the individual layers that make up this composition, and now we have a new tab at the top of the timeline panel. Now it's easy to navigate through your tab comps. Simply click on them to reveal them. If you want to close them, you can click on the X over on the right tab, and if you want to open it up again, make sure to go back to the main sequence and double click it and it will reopen. So if I click back into the main sequence, we can see that this single comp contains 7 composition layers. For this project, I have chosen to organize my main sequence into 7 separate compositions. So why would I do this? Well, in After Effects, we can use compositions as a way to focus on particular sequences, organize and streamline a project. Each section here has complex video and animation settings with many layers. I have organized my main sequence in this way to make it nice and easy to manage each section individually, so my main composition is not full of layers and overly complicated. This also gives me the flexibility to move each section around as a whole and order the video sequence differently if I so choose. Okay, so now we know what compositions are. How do we create them? So there are a number of ways you can create a comp. One way is to come to the bottom of the project panel here on the left. Notice at the bottom of the panel we have the composition icon here. If we click this, up will pop the composition settings box. So here there are a range of settings we can customize. As a beginner, you only really need to pay attention to the comp name, dimensions, frame rate and duration. So at the top you can name your comp, and I'll just call this new comp 1. Down below, under preset, we can set the dimensions. Now this will default to the original composition you started the project with. In this instance, it's 1920 by 1080, our current standard dimension for video. This is what we want for now. Now frame rate is regional. Depending on what part of the world you're from, you will need to assign a particular frame rate. Here in Europe, we use 25 frames per second, so I'm going to use that for now. Next is duration, and we can set this for however long we want our composition to last. In this instance, I'll set it to 10 seconds. Now here you can also set the background color, but for now, I'll just keep it set to black. Once happy, I'll click OK. So upon click, you will now see your composition open down in the timeline panel. We can see the time span is 10 seconds across the top here, and up in the visual composition panel, we can see the black screen. Now, it's important to note that when you create a new composition in your project, it will always appear in the project panel. If we look in the project panel here on the left, we can now see our new comp 1 is present at the bottom. This composition is now ready to start bringing in visual elements to create a video sequence. But for now, I'll click the X in the top left corner of the tab to close it. Now, there are two other ways to create a composition. First, you can simply press the keyboard shortcut Command N on Mac or Control N for PC. Upon click, this will bring up the composition settings just like earlier, and I'll just hit cancel. The second way to create a comp is to come up to the top menu, click Composition, click New Composition, and upon click, you will see the composition settings again. So quite easy to create a new composition. Now, once a composition is created, you can edit it. For example, change the name, duration, or the frame rate. To do this, you can come over into the project panel, right-click on the composition and select Composition Settings. Upon click, you will see the same settings you saw when you created the comp. Here, you can make any modifications and click OK. Now, another way, for example, if you see a composition in your timeline, you can double-click it to open it, then come up to Composition in the top bar and simply click Composition Settings. Easy. And that brings us to the end of this video. So to recap, some key things to remember are compositions are like individual video sequences. A typical After Effects project will have multiple compositions. Compositions make it easier to organize complexity. Compositions contain both visual and time information represented in two separate panels, the timeline panel and the visual composition panel. And when you create a composition, it appears in the project panel. Now, in After Effects, every element that is brought into the program is placed into the project panel. And we saw in this video that when created, compositions are also stored in this panel. Now, it may help to think of this project panel as a kind of links panel. Now, as a beginner, there are a few important things you will need to learn about this panel before we move on. In the next video, I'm going to discuss the project panel in a bit more depth and show you how compositions, as well as all media elements brought into the program, are managed and placed into your timeline panel ready for editing. So see you in the next video.